The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence or the sprawling size of the estate, but how often the gates were already unlocked when I reached them. This property spanned several hundred acres of fenced woodland and pasture. Part of my job as caretaker was to open and close sections depending on inspections, grazing rotations, and the weather. It was a lonely task. I thought nothing of it the first time, dismissing it as a simple mistake. But by the second morning, I reached the south access gate and found it hanging open, the padlock still in place, but not secured. I thought someone must have forgotten. I logged it as an oversight, but the pattern kept repeating. Each day, I locked the gates and returned to find them open. Not just the gates. Feed sheds were accessed, but nothing was taken. Tools were moved slightly out of place. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. It wasn't robbery. It was more deliberate. By the fourth day, I stopped assuming these were mistakes and started marking the times. Gates I locked at noon were wide open again by evening. The tool shed was sometimes left ajar, with the tools arranged differently. The feed storage was accessed, and someone had even adjusted the stock, though nothing was missing. Whoever was doing this wasn't looking for food or supplies. They were familiar with the routine. The worst part was when I found fresh tire tracks in a section of the property that could only be reached by ATV. The tracks led into the trees and stopped at a clearing near the old equipment barn. That barn had been sealed off years ago, deemed structurally unsafe. It wasn't supposed to be accessible, yet there were clear signs that someone had driven in. I stood in the clearing for a moment, listening. The trees were still, the wind barely stirring. I approached the barn cautiously, trying to ignore the growing sense that I was being watched. I reached for the side door, expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It swung open easily with a creak, and when I stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't dust or age. It was recent fresh air, slightly musty, like someone had been there not long before. The barn's interior was unnervingly organized, as if someone had been staying there. There were food wrappers in a corner, neatly bagged, and a portable battery pack was charging from an extension line that had been hooked up to the barn's old power outlet. It was clear this wasn't a one-time stop. Someone was using the barn as a base, living off the grid and hiding out in plain sight. I stepped back out to call the property manager, but as I reached for my phone, I heard it. The door shut behind me, not slammed, but gently closed. When I reached for the handle to open it, it wouldn't budge. My heart skipped. I pulled again, harder this time, but the door stayed locked. A second later, I heard the unmistakable sound of the padlock sliding into place from the outside. I froze. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside the barn. I had no way to escape. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You can," a man's voice replied. "But we know what time you start your perimeter checks. We know you stop at the east fence around 6:40, and you take the county road home, not the highway. You live alone, rental off Mason Creek. White truck with the cracked rear light. We're not interested in you. Keep it that way." There was no rush in his voice, no urgency. It felt like he had already decided how things would unfold. The words hung in the air, thick with an unsettling confidence. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and moved deeper into the barn, ignoring the sick feeling in my stomach. I needed to find a way out. I spotted an old livestock access hatch on the far wall, half rusted and wired shut. I pulled at the wire, the metal scraping against my hands. The wire snapped suddenly, cutting into my palm. The sting hit hard, but I didn't stop. I didn't care about the pain. I had to get out of there. With the wire snapped, the hatch opened, just enough to squeeze through. I shoved my body through the gap, barely able to fit, and dropped into the thick brush behind the barn. I landed badly, my knee slamming into a buried root hard enough to knock the breath out of me. I stayed still for a moment, hand stinging, knee throbbing, trying to steady my racing heart. My thoughts screamed for me to move, to get up and run, but I waited. I counted slowly to 10, listening for any sign of pursuit, but nothing came. When I finally gathered myself and circled back to the clearing from a distance, I saw that the barn was empty, not abandoned, just empty, as if whoever had been there had been gone long enough to cover their tracks. But it wasn't an escape. It was a planned withdrawal. I called the law enforcement agency directly, bypassing the estate manager. They came out and searched the property, but they didn't find much at first. Still, they eventually uncovered hidden shelters deep in the woods, concealed behind dense underbrush. They found fuel caches, spare supplies, and even evidence that vehicles were being temporarily stored on site before being moved elsewhere. The manager finally admitted he had known about activity, but avoided reporting it because he didn't want to jeopardize the sale of the property. I quit that day. The estate sold 3 months later, and I thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks after the new owners moved in, a storage building burned down. Officials called it vandalism, but I knew what it really was. It wasn't vandalism. It was a reminder the barn had been left standing for a reason. The estate was still useful, still being monitored, and whoever had been using it wasn't finished. The estate was advertised as unoccupied, but that turned out to be a technicality. The main house was empty, but the outbuildings weren't. From the first night, I noticed signs of recent use. Extension cords plugged in where I had unplugged them, generator fuel lower than expected, and chairs angled toward windows. I assumed locals cutting through, but it ended when I found the basement storage room, unlocked from the inside, a room with no external access. Someone had been in the house, nothing missing, just adjusted. When I reported it, the estate office dismissed it, saying the previous caretaker had left abruptly, but didn't elaborate. That night, on my second evening, I heard movement upstairs while I was in the kitchen, slow, deliberate steps, like someone was testing my reaction. I froze, listening. The sound perfectly timed, as if they knew I'd hear it. I checked the hallway, and the attic ladder was down, something I hadn't touched. A cold shiver ran through me, a sudden instinct to get out. But when I climbed halfway up and saw the flickering light at the top, I felt the air thin, suffocating, as if the space around me had gotten smaller. My pulse sped up, and I backed down quickly, heart racing, adrenaline spiking. I needed to leave at first light, but When I tried the mudroom door in the morning, the handle wouldn't turn. The deadbolt was engaged from the outside. I tried the front door. Same thing. Panic flooded me, and I started shaking. I grabbed the radio, but there was no signal. I shouted toward the window, but it felt like the house had swallowed my voice. I took a deep breath, forcing my words to steady me. "I'm calling the police," I said aloud. The silence hung heavy until the voice from the hallway answered, too calm, too measured. "You can," the voice said, a soft, deliberate tone. "But you won't be able to reach them. We know your routine. We know when you go to town, when you check the generator. We've been waiting for you." The door rattled, a faint sound that made my stomach drop. I didn't wait for another word. I moved to the window, peering through the small hole in the blinds. There, just beyond the porch light, I saw a figure moving away from the house, walking leisurely, like they had no need to rush. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and tried dialing, praying for any signal. It failed again and again. My fingers trembled as I tried to dial, each attempt bringing the fear of being too late. Hours passed in silence, the house feeling like a tomb around me. I checked the door again, and it was still locked. The hallway remained empty, silent. I could feel the air in the room pressing in on me, the suffocating weight of something waiting. I sat by the window, watching the dark forest stretch beyond the yard, the quiet only broken by the creaks of the house settling, the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. The night seemed to drag on, every second feeling like an eternity. I had to get out. The thought hit me like a hammer, sudden and sharp. I didn't care how, I just had to go. I moved to the back, found the narrow pantry window, and tried to open it. The rusted metal screeched as I forced it, the sharp edge of the frame cutting into my forearm as I shoved it wide enough to slip through. The pain was a distant thought compared to the urgent need to escape. I tumbled out into the yard, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I ran for the trees, my breath coming in ragged bursts, legs aching, but I kept going, praying I wasn't being followed. I glanced back, but saw no one. The house seemed to recede in the distance, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had made it. Then the snap of a twig cut through the silence. My heart skipped. I pushed harder, but the sound of gravel crunching beneath feet told me they were still there, moving with methodical ease, tracking my every step. It wasn't a chase. They were waiting for me to slip. I stumbled over uneven ground, but I pushed on, desperate to lose them, to find somewhere to hide. The sound of their pursuit grew closer, steady and deliberate, the space between us narrowing. I found a creek, ducking under a patch of thick brush, holding my breath, praying they couldn't hear the rapid thudding of my heart. I stayed still, waiting, the cold water trickling beneath me, listening for any sign they'd found me. The sound of their footsteps finally faded, but I didn't move. I stayed low, muscles stiff from the tension, listening intently, waiting for any sound to tell me they were still looking. After what felt like hours, I finally shifted, moving slowly toward the road, not knowing who, if anyone, would be there. When I reached the road, a car came by, and I waved it down, not caring who it was. The driver didn't ask questions. I climbed in, and we drove off, leaving the estate behind. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I immediately called the police. They came out later, but found nothing. No forced entry, no signs of anyone being there. The estate office denied any knowledge of what had happened, and when I tried to speak to the new caretakers, they claimed they hadn't seen anything unusual. But I knew they had been there. They knew my schedule. They had been following me for who knows how long, and I had never even seen them